So thank you all for joining. We've got a quick overview of election results, and then I'll be taking questions from folks. So first, I wanted to dive into the races we still don't know yet and talk a little bit about why. Then I'll go into the races we do know, what the factors at play were, and talk a little bit about what's going to happen in the weeks to come. So let's go to North Carolina's election results page here. And let's take a look at everything. So we've got three races that are not yet known from my calling, and there's about five races not yet officially called by the Associated Press. So there are two state Senate races, Senate District 18 and Senate District 42. So I have called this race for Democrat Woodson Bradley, and that gives a 30-19 GOP advantage in the Senate. And so the reason I had called this was if you had taken half of the provisionals, which is being very, very generous, and you also assumed that a good chunk of them went to Bradley or a good chunk of them went to McGinn, it still wouldn't be enough. So McGinn would need like 86% of outstanding provisionals if even half of the provisionals are counting. So both of those were very generous. So that's why this race I have called for Woodson Bradley. That will be the 19th seat for Democrats. This one in Senate District 18, it remains way too close to call. So this is the Wake County seat, and here is a look at how close this seat remains here. We've got 38 votes separating the Republican challenger, Ashley Adams, for this open seat, and State Representative Terrence Everett, the Democrat, who's trying to get a promotion to the Senate. There's a 38 vote difference, as you can see. And this is a district that includes Granville County and Wake County. So Granville County has given me a number of outstanding ballots. That alone makes this enough that's still too close to call. So it might be some time before we have updated numbers and some calls to make. Wake County, we are waiting on updated numbers for them as well. So that's Senate District 18 and why that hasn't been called yet. Now to the House side, there are two races the AP has yet to call. That would be House District 32, featuring Democrat Brian Cohn trying to unseat Republican State Representative Frank Sossaman. And in that district, it is razor thin as well. Let's take a look at House District 32 here in North Carolina. Now, this is another Granville County seat, which is just north of Raleigh. And you can see the vote count difference here is under 200. And we have no provisionals counted, so we're still waiting on that. And that could sway the outcome. So for now, it's still too early and too close to call that race. The other one the Associated Press has not called is House District 105. This is Tricia Cotham's seat. I have called this. Based on Mecklenburg County numbers we saw yesterday, one thing that's interesting is there are 215 votes that Cotham is ahead of Sidman by. Nicole Sidman's the Democratic challenger, but there's only 214 provisionals. So if all the provisionals counted, and if Nicole Sidman had gotten 100% of them, she'd still fall just short. So I had called this earlier, and so I have that race as called. So basically, House District 32 and Senate District 18 are the two that I have uncalled at the legislative level. The only statewide race that I have uncalled and the AP has uncalled is the Supreme Court race. Now, it looks like it's going to go for Jefferson Griffin, but I don't have the outstanding number of absentee votes that have not yet been counted statewide. We do have the knowledge that there's 63,000 provisionals out there. So Allison Riggs would need about 2/3 of them if no mail-ins came in. So it's going to be a big stretch for Riggs, most likely, and Griffin's most likely going to win, but still too early to call. And as you can see, we had a sweep for Republicans at the Court of Appeals level. And so finally, I just wanted to go to the results for the races that we do know and talk a little bit about why some of those things might have happened. So if you also have questions, let me know in the chat or feel free to raise your hand, and I'm happy to take questions in a minute as well. So for these statewide races, Council of State, as you can see, one thing that's very notable is we had Trump carry this state by 3.4 points, yet Josh Stein, the Democrat for governor, carried the state by over 14 points, closer to 15 points. And the polling average for Real Clear Politics going into this was 14.3 points for Mark Robinson. So as you can tell, the polls pretty much nailed that race. And polls had really shown at the presidential race, Harris and Trump within the margin of error. That's about in line. I think Trump slightly overperformed what polls had shown. But definitely the polls got it right on the governor's race going for Stein and very handily for Stein. Now, the only congressional race of note was Dawn Davis in the first district. Lori Buckout had conceded on Wednesday. She was the Republican challenger, and she had conceded on Wednesday. The Associated Press had called the race 24 hours later on Thursday. So that race is over, and Dawn Davis will be reelected to the U.S. House very narrowly. But will it be enough to sway the outcome for the U.S. House? Most likely not. It looks like Republicans are in a prime position to retake control of the U.S. House. And as you can see, they need 7 more races, and a couple of them are pretty likely to go to Republicans from what we see. The rest are still too early or too close to call, especially in California, where a lot of outstanding ballots still remain and have to be counted. But if you're Democrats right now, you're not liking this number. It appears Republicans will have an ever so slight majority in the U.S. House, and that would be full control of Congress and the White House from what we're seeing right now. Now, to the Council of State races in North Carolina, let me pull those up. One thing that we have seen is we saw Senator Rachel Hunt defeat Hal Weatherman, pick up the lieutenant governor seat. We saw Jeff Jackson retain the attorney general seat. We saw Elaine Marshall retain her seat, and Democrats pick up the superintendent of public instruction race. Democrats lost a seat on the Council of State for auditor, with Jessica Holmes narrowly losing to Dave Bullock for state auditor. Other than that, pretty predictable. Ag commissioner for Troxler, Luke Farley for labor commissioner. Mike Causey narrowly won his insurance commissioner reelection bid, and Brad Briner narrowly won the treasurer, well, pretty sizably won the treasurer race, and that went for Dale Folwell previously, so it's staying in Republican hands. And to give you a different look at the Council of State races, let me just pull that up. I mean, you can see Stein here with 54% of the vote, and it's much more narrow for other candidates. So it shows that ticket splitting is still a very real phenomenon here in North Carolina. So let me go to questions as I'm seeing them. Thank you for the question. Spencer says, Brian, I understand that North Carolina is a purple state and tends to elect folks from both parties in multiple statewide positions. Can you maybe speak on why it seems that governor/AG is typically a Democrat? And it seems that, especially the last few elections, we tend to elect Republicans to judicial positions. I always find this interesting. Yes, so that's a very good question. So for the governor's race and lieutenant governor's race, and even the AG's race, those have all been very, very close in the past. Like Josh Stein won by very slim margins previously. You also had Sherry Beasley lose in 2020 for her state Supreme Court reelection bid by 401 votes out of millions counted. So these aren't the number of ticket splitters or people open to ticket splitting might be like 1 in 10 North Carolinians or so, and they are really swaying which direction it goes. So what we saw that was particularly notable was people seem to be really examining candidate quality for those 1 in 10 swayable people. Now, at the top of the ticket, you had Donald Trump, and people were overwhelmingly citing the economy as their number one issue and blaming Biden for that. And so Trump had won, and Harris hadn't been able to differentiate herself. And one might expect North Carolina, well, the presidential results will closely mirror what happened statewide. but there's still those roughly 1 in 10 persuadable North Carolinians who are willing to cross party lines on certain ones. And so what we saw was really a rejection this election cycle of some of the more hardline conservatives in the state. Dan Bishop, known for House Bill 2. We saw a Hal Weatherman, who was a previous political operative for then Lieutenant Governor Dan Forest. And then we also saw Mark Robinson, who had a host of, let's call them personal issues, including a CNN story. But even before that story broke, people in his political orbit were telling me they had really seen this race as going in the wrong direction from a strategic point of view. So that was a very unique one that's it's hard to extrapolate much besides people just really rejected Mark Robinson in that race. And for Jeff Jackson, I think what we saw was the House Bill 2 effect for Dan Bishop had cost him. Dan Bishop was more known. And David, to answer your question on why not Wesley Harris, I think what we had seen for Jeff Jackson was a lot of benefit from ads. Like he had put a lot of money into the race. He was trying to link Mark Robinson to Dan Bishop. And Dan Bishop had said, he'd be Robinson's sidekick. So there was something different about that. Whereas with the state treasurer race, like very few people have heard of Brad Briner, and it's a lot less money on the airwaves, and it's a lot harder to link Brad Briner to Donald Trump or Mark Robinson, especially as he's someone who has worked for Michael Bloomberg, who ran for a Democratic presidential ticket a while back. So I think Brad Briner had really won this race because there's a lot of voters who just see, you want to keep a financial position like the role of treasurer in GOP hands. That was rewarding an incumbent. And well, I think it's really Republicans finishing the ballot. Democrats had finished the ballot from what I had seen on the governor's race, the attorney general race. And there's a lot of people who just don't know what the role of a treasurer is. And so they don't vote the lower it gets. I think what we had seen was really people rewarding incumbents. The one exception I will say is Jessica Holmes. That might have surprised a few people because she's the incumbent. But it's worth noting she ran for labor commissioner in 2020. She was a known statewide figure who lost in 2020. And in a year where Trump won by even larger margins than he did in 2020, might not be that surprising to see Auditor Holmes lose. But that was probably the biggest surprise I have heard from Democrats when it comes to a statewide Council of State race. So the next thing I want to go to is turnout here. So let's go to turnout here for county. So one thing that we had seen was Hurricane Helene. There was a lot of talk of would Hurricane Helene cause this drop in turnout? And as you can see, we had 75.15% turnout in those 13 counties. And you can see the statewide turnout is 73.02. So with the exception of Watauga and Rutherford, 11 of those 13 counties exceeded the statewide average. And that is very notable, particularly because there was concern that after a natural disaster that would depress turnout. Now, I was personally always skeptical of that notion because I saw a lot of frustrated voters who were frustrated in these hurricane areas by Trump's rhetoric on blaming Democrats for the hurricane. I also saw Republicans animated feeling that maybe the state was slower to respond in the early days. So with that frustration, it shouldn't be that surprising that voter turnout was higher than the statewide average in these counties. But a couple of the ones to really watch for were Buncombe County, Henderson County, and in Henderson County, Republicans really showed up on election day. And Buncombe County, election day wasn't as strong. So that might have helped Trump more than the early voting numbers, because with early voting, Trump was really, really struggling in these areas. But it looks like people showed up for him in these Hurricane Helene counties in the end. So that was just something that's pretty notable. The other turnout takeaway that I do have that I should share is just with regard to which counties showed up and which counties didn't in this election cycle. So which counties showed up, let me pull that up for everybody. So as you can see here, uh, the real big ones that cost Democrats were Mecklenburg County and Cumberland County. Now, I had previewed in my 8 counties to watch story Cumberland County. There's a lot of talk about Charlotte. There's a lot of talk about Greensboro and Guilford County, Durham and Durham County, Raleigh and Wake County. Uh, all these areas where there's a decent amount of Democrats and black voters, but Cumberland County seemed to be an area of concern based on early voting numbers. And in the end, it seems that it was just as much of a struggle. You saw 62% turnout in Cumberland County, which includes the city of Fayetteville, which is well lower than the 73% statewide average. And it's worth noting as well that Cumberland County is the most heavily black populated county of all the counties that have 100,000 registered voters. And Cumberland County had the third worst turnout of all 100 counties. So that is something to really keep an eye out for and is a concern for Democrats, uh, particularly with black voters as they try and reach out to them. Another concern that Democrats had was in Mecklenburg County. That ended up at 69% turnout, which was the 14th lowest in the state. So pretty notable drop in turnout in Meck and in Cumberland. And the takeaway from that should really be that Fayetteville isn't getting much attention that it deserves. It's a giant red flag for Democrats. And there's a lot of work still to be done in Mecklenburg County. We have seen in 2008, that was a big reason Obama won this state. But Democrats have really struggled to replicate that success. Former President Barack Obama visited the Charlotte area as well, and he did that on the campaign trail for Harris in the closing weeks. But that didn't seem to move the needle, and the data bears that out as well. The other thing I want to quickly show folks is New Hanover County and Wilson County, because I think those are two bellwethers to monitor going forward. So let's take a look at the turnout results here in New Hanover. So in New Hanover County, let's break that down for all contests. So New Hanover County, so far, it's looking good for Harris. She's up by 3 percentage points, and she's probably going to carry New Hanover County. But it's not as simple as that because, as folks might remember, this is a district that had gone for Biden. And in 2024, it went for Harris, but it went for Harris by a lot slimmer of a margin. So overall, statewide, North Carolina went more for Trump by 2.1 points. And in New Hanover County, it went more for Trump by 1.8 points. So pretty in line with the statewide average. And New Hanover County includes the city of Wilmington, very much still a bellwether for folks. Now, looking at the rest of it, Josh Stein, he ended up winning. Here, he took this county by 25 points. Rachel Hunt, she won lieutenant governor's race. Jeff Jackson won the AG's race. Jessica Holmes lost the auditor race. Steve Troxler won Ag Commission. Mike Causey won Insurance Commission. Luke Farley won Labor Commission. Elaine Marshall, Secretary of State. Mo Green, Superintendent. And Brad Briner for Treasurer. So all 9 out of those 10 Council of State races that New Hanover had gone for ended up winning the statewide election. Now, that was the exact same case in 2020. And again, in 2020, the outlier, the one that was wrong, if you will, was for Jessica Holmes when she was running for the Labor Commissioner. So again, Jessica Holmes was preferred pretty narrowly by voters in New Hanover. With that exception, New Hanover correctly predicted all Council of State races and was generally going the way the state was trending when it comes to the presidential level. So that's about New Hanover County. So now the final thing to really go over is just what is left. So we have a Supreme Court race that's still too early or too close to call, but it's very close to calling territory, and it looks like Jefferson Griffin is going to win that. And it seems to be more of a question of when than if at this stage. The other races that are still uncalled, Senate District 18, which will determine whether Republicans have 30 or 31 seats. They're going to keep their Senate supermajority regardless. Now, the last one is House District 32. So this is the reason I have not called a supermajority. This is the reason the Associated Press has not called the supermajority. House District 32, the Democrat is up by 0.4 percentage points, but there's still enough outstanding votes to make a realistic or potential difference. So it's still too early to say there. Certainly, you're happier if you're Democrats. It seems like it could very well go in your hands, but it's still too early. Now, if Democrats win, that will break the GOP supermajority. Republicans have 71 seats secured. If Sossaman came back, the incumbent, and won House District 32, then what we would see is we would see Republicans with a 72 vote supermajority. Now, if Cohn holds on in this district, then what you're going to see is you're going to see 49 Democrats, which is just barely enough to break the supermajority. Now, I asked leaders in both parties about this, and what Destin Hall, the next state house speaker, said was that he has a governing supermajority. We saw Tim Moore use that same exact language back in 2023, and as we know, Tricia Cotham, then Democrat from Mecklenburg County, now Republican, had switched parties in April of 2023. So there is some chatter that there is an effort by Republicans to make that happen again. And if you're looking for who is potentially swayable in going there, at the top of the list is State Representative Cecil Brockman of Guilford County. Now, from my reporting, shortly after the Cotham party switch, there was Cecil Brockman who was considering switching parties. Now, will or will that not happen remains to be seen. It's worth noting that redistricting is now over. So if Brockman switched parties, it would be awfully hard to redraw him in Guilford County. And Brockman could very well lose that reelection bid if he were to do so in 2026 as a Republican. Brockman has said that he's still a Democrat, but if you're looking at which of the 49 Democrats you are most concerned about switching parties, from everybody I've spoken to from previous reporting, Brockman's at the top of the list. There's also Carla Cunningham of Mecklenburg County, who who crosses party lines on vetoes from time to time. There's also Shelley Willingham, Edgecombe County, who crosses party lines from time to time. There's Garland Pierce, who crosses party lines from time to time. But really, Cecil Brockman is probably at the top of the list of Democrats to watch. He'll be very influential. And Brockman also was absent a whole lot during his time in this past legislative session, one of the highest absenteeism rates. And Democrats need all but one person to be in session if Republicans are all there. So in other words, Republicans can still override vetoes if all of them are together in the same room and there's two Democrats absent. So if Cecil Brockman's off the floor and another Democrat's off the floor, then Republicans can hold override votes. So don't be surprised to see Republicans potentially reaching out to Democrats like Brockman to see if they'll switch. And don't be surprised if there's lawmakers who are off the floor at the wrong time when votes are cast. We have seen that happen previously. So Democrats might be on track to have a supermajority, but it is very razor thin, and there's going to be a lot of just logistical hurdles for the party to maintain that for the next 2 years. So those are things to watch for when it comes to the supermajority. It's a foregone conclusion. The Senate is definite supermajority. The House, the supermajority could still be a pathway if Frank Sossaman wins, but he's not on a track to doing so. But still, again, in that race, too close to call. Spencer has a question. He asks, how does this work? What kind of notice is given that a veto vote is upcoming? So for that, I can tell you a story of September 11th, 2019, when there was a surprise vote taken on a budget bill. And since then, the legislature has not been the same over the last 5 years. There was basically a vote in the House when they saw there weren't enough Democrats on the floor, and they said, we're going to call this vote. Now, there's some scrutiny over that because one House Republican leader who's no longer in the General Assembly had apparently told people there would be no votes that day, but that doesn't stop Republicans from having the ability to vote. So if you're the Speaker of the House, you have wide latitude over when you call a vote. And there are some procedural mechanisms that Democrats could have done back in 2019 to stall things a little bit more that they didn't do. And by all accounts, House Democratic leader Robert Reeves is a lawyer. He knows those rules well. He could use those if he's on the floor. But still, if you don't have members present and they're out of the area or attending an event elsewhere, the speaker has a lot of latitude over when a vote is called. So uh, now, traditionally, what they'll say is the day before, they'll say, we expect to have overrides the next day. So usually there's notice that, hey, we're going to have votes tomorrow. In other words, if you don't want to see an override happen, be on the floor. And then what Republicans can do is say, well, we'll just table that bill until the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, until you come to a time where there's not enough Democrats on the House floor and you can just sort of whip the vote in your head from the floor of the House. So that is the latitude that is there. There's no hard law that says something must be in print for X amount of time in the House. And it's worth noting as well that there are procedural rules that are drafted every single legislative session. And so Republicans are free to pretty much write their own rules for how they want the legislature to function in 2025 and 2026. Those are just chamber procedure rules that can be rewritten and are often slightly adjusted year to year. And based on the language currently, it's easier for Republicans to hold veto overrides than it previously was. So if you're Democrats and you're celebrating the supermajority, you're going to have to do so with a big grain of salt. And the one thing I would say is there's a big difference between having 49 seats and 50 seats, because now you're vulnerable to the whims of one out of 49 Democrats who is willing to cross party lines, or two Democrats out of 49 who are just off the floor at the wrong time. So there's not a lot of wiggle room to the supermajority for Democrats. And if Republicans strategically time things, they could have a lot of legislative accomplishments despite not having a supermajority. So it remains to be seen. The last thing I want to talk about for folks before clocking out and heading off is just with one other area. So let me pull out this race. This was in Wilson County. Dante Pittman was in House District 32. Now, with his win, that really gave the supermajority for Democrats. So this was a big, big win. And it's also worth noting Don Davis won the lone toss-up congressional race that covers this area. But it's more complicated in northeastern North Carolina. So in Wilson County, Davis did well, Pittman did well. But if you go over to Nash County, Lisa Stone Barnes won the state Senate reelection bid, and you had Alan Chesser win his reelection bid for state house. So northeastern North Carolina remains a complicated place. There was a reason I had Wilson and Nash County separately in my counties to watch and didn't just bundle them into one. And what's notable here is that Roy Cooper, he has been on the ballot at a presidential level ever since 1988 in Nash County. He was in the legislature. He had run for AG, never lost an election, ran for governor. This was his first presidential election cycle. And since 1988, he was on the ballot. So 1984, you have to go back roughly 40 years to find a time where Nash County voters couldn't see Roy Cooper on their ballot. So that was a very interesting dynamic that could have hurt some down ballot Democrats and is going to be one to watch. Two things to eye going forward is the U.S. Senate race. Thom Tillis is up for re-election in 2026. And it's worth noting that Mark Robinson is not a friend of Senator Thom Tillis, to put it mildly. They've taken barbs at traded barbs, taken aim at each other. And Mark Robinson could still run for U.S. Senate. He has said he'll spend early next year with his family and then reflect on his future going forward. So he's not someone who has completely ruled out a future in North Carolina politics. So when Madison Cawthorn has lost a congressional race, when Bo Hines has twice lost a congressional race, we'd sort of seen them fall off the map in their political desires going forward. That's not the case just yet, at least with Mark Robinson. So something to watch there. We've also seen Wiley Nickel. He was a congressman, say he was looking at a run in 2026. From sources I've spoken to, they see Roy Cooper now as increasingly likely to run for U.S. Senate in 2026. And that's because there's no Kamala Harris administration. There's no cabinet position for Cooper. The next election cycle would be 2026 U.S. Senate. Last question I'll take for Spencer. You asked, wouldn't losing by 15 points kind of rule him out from GOP's perspective? So it's hard to say what's a disqualifying factor in politics these days, just generally speaking. It's hard to say this crosses the line and that makes someone ruled out. And I had asked earlier this week, I want to say it was Wednesday, I believe. Might have been yesterday. The days are blurring together. But after the election, I had asked Jason Simmons, the North Carolina Republican Party chairman, about a criticism I had heard from former Governor Pat McCrory and other Republicans who said, state party, you screwed up Mark Robinson, you didn't do your vetting of him, and you should have somehow prevented him from running. Now, the state party's response to me has always been, we don't get involved in primaries per our bylaws, and that's where we stand on it. But there's a lot of Republicans who want to take it to the next level and say, well, fine, but you can do something before they even become a candidate. So I think you're going to see an increased spotlight and more people in Robinson's ear discouraging a run than you had seen previously. Robinson also handily won a primary where there were almost 10 candidates in the lieutenant governor's race in 2020. Handily won that primary and won it outright. So he is still a very popular figure in conservative circles. And Tom Tillis is known for crossing party lines on infrastructure, on a few other things. And in a Republican partisan primary, it's all about the base. And Robinson still has a strong base. Whether that base could be enough to carry him to a victory in a general election, seems we saw our answer there. So that's probably that 15-point margin, the worst since 1980 for any gubernatorial candidate in this state, is going to be a tough pill for Republicans to swallow and will be a reason many try to discourage him from running. But ultimately, it's on individuals to decide whether they run or not. Other people can't remove the party can only do so much. We didn't see them do a lot to prevent Robinson preemptively this cycle, but in 2026 we could. So that's just a little bit of forward-looking news to watch for a potential Roy Cooper Senate bid, see what that means for Wiley Nickel. And we're also looking at Robinson, Tillis. That's going to be an interesting dynamic to watch, certainly going forward. So with that, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'll have a full recording available at andersonalerts.substack.com. The latest post I have is this link to this Zoom. And so I will share a full recording there if you want to rewatch it as well. So hope that was helpful. Hope that was informative. I might be doing one more next week when we know more results. There's 3 outstanding races to call, and hopefully I'll have some candidates on when we have all our results. And a reminder, I do make predictions on races. I don't share those. I keep them internal. But once all 24 races I'm tracking have been called, I share an aggregate number. So my target is 18 out of 24 correctly calling races. Right now, I won't say what that number is because they're still uncalled races. But once those 3 outstanding races get called, then I'll release that so everyone can know just how off or how accurate I was. So with that, thank you guys so much. Stay tuned for more coverage and have a nice weekend. Stay safe, y'all. Take care.